The Plaza Hotel has this revolving door that always makes me feel like I'm stepping into a different version of my life. That Saturday evening in late September, I pushed through it wearing the navy dress I'd bought specifically for this night, my hair still slightly damp at the nape because I'd rushed out of the shower after my last patient consultation. My name is Harper Whitlock. I'm 31 years old, and for 7 years I'd been training to become a pediatric cardiac surgeon at Mount Sinai. That morning I'd received my board certification. That evening was supposed to be the celebration my mother had insisted on planning for me at the Palm Court restaurant on the ground floor. The Meherdese smiled when I gave my last name. Right this way, Dr. Whitlock. Even hearing the title out loud still made something flutter in my chest. 7 years of 100-hour weeks. 7 years of missed weddings, missed funerals, missed birthdays of my own. Tonight, I was finally going to sit across from my family and feel, for once, like all of it had meant something. The Palm Court is one of those rooms where the ceiling is made of stained glass and the chandeliers look like they belong in a French opera. I told my mother weeks ago that I wanted something simple. She'd insisted on the Palm Court because, in her words, your sister deserves to celebrate somewhere nice for once. I hadn't pushed back. I never did. When I rounded the corner into the dining room, I stopped walking. My mother was at the table closest to the windows, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. My younger sister was leaning back in her chair, swirling what was clearly the last sip of a glass of red wine. Between them sat the wreckage of an entire dinner. 3 plates with smears of demi-glace, a bread basket reduced to crumbs, 2 empty wine glasses on a side table, a half-eaten chocolate souffle that someone had stabbed with a spoon and given up on. I checked my watch. I was 12 minutes late. Not 2 hours. 12 minutes. My pager had gone off during my Uber ride because a kid in the cardiac unit had spiked a fever, and I'd had to call in to walk the resident through the order set. 12 minutes. My mother looked up and her face did this thing. It always does, where her mouth smiles but her eyes recalculate. There you are, she said, like I was a misplaced earring she'd found under a couch cushion. Perfect timing. My sister snorted into her napkin. Took you long enough, we were starving. I just stood there. The hostess was hovering behind me with a 3rd menu in her hand, looking confused. I couldn't make my mouth form a sentence. Sit down, my mother said, waving at the empty chair like I was the one being rude. We didn't want the food to get cold. You said you might be late, so we figured we'd just go ahead. Have some dessert? The souffle is incredible. You ordered without me. It came out flat. I wasn't even asking a question. Honey, we ordered an hour ago. The kitchen was about to close the prix fixe menu. My mother folded her napkin into a neat triangle. We saved you the souffle. My sister was scrolling through her phone. She was wearing a dress I recognized from my own closet, a silk wrap dress I'd bought in Milan 3 years ago and never worn because I never went anywhere. She'd taken it without asking. She'd been doing that since we were kids. I used to think it was flattering. I sat down because my legs were trembling and I didn't trust myself to keep standing. The hostess set down the 3rd menu, gave me a look that I now realize was pity, and walked away. So, my mother said, brightening, tell us about your day. I opened my mouth to answer, and that's when our waiter appeared with the leather folio. He set it down on the white tablecloth in the dead center between the 3 of us and said, "Whenever you're ready, ladies, no rush." My sister's hand shot out fast. She grabbed the folio, flipped it open, glanced at the bill, and slid it across the table. It came to rest directly in front of me. The total was $4,287. Happy promotion, doctor, my sister said. She was smiling wide enough to show her back molars. This is your present. I looked at my mother. I waited for her to say something, to reach for the bill, to tell my sister she was being ridiculous. Anything. My mother lifted her water glass to her lips and took a slow, delicate sip. It's only fair, sweetheart. We've been carrying the family for so long while you were off at the hospital, and you make so much more than the rest of us. Consider it a small thank you to your sister for putting up with all the times you couldn't be there. I think the strangest thing about that moment was how quiet everything got. The piano in the corner kept playing. People at other tables kept laughing, but inside my own head, every sound just stopped. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I could hear the napkin shifting on my lap. I looked down at the bill. I looked at the souffle. I looked at my sister, who was already mentally somewhere else, scrolling through Instagram on a phone in a case I'd bought her last Christmas, and I started laughing. Not a big laugh, a small one, the kind that comes out when you finally understand a joke that was never funny. Something funny? My mother said. Yeah, I said. Yeah, actually. I picked up the leather folio, I closed it, I set it back down in the center of the table. I'm not paying this. My mother's face did that recalculation thing again. Faster this time. Excuse me? You ate without me. At my celebration, and now you want me to pay for it. I picked up my purse from the back of the chair. No, I'm not doing that. Don't be dramatic, my sister said, finally putting her phone down. It's like $4,000. You make $400,000 a year. You won't even feel it. That's not the point. Then what is the point? My mother's voice had gotten that brittle edge it always got when I disappointed her. Tonight was about family. Tonight was about being together. And you couldn't even be bothered to show up on time. I was 12 minutes late. You were late, you ruined the evening for everyone. She was leaning forward now, that low-controlled tone she used to use when I was a kid, and she was about to send me to my room. And now you're throwing a tantrum in a 5-star restaurant. This is exactly why your sister gets all the attention. She at least knows how to behave. I stood up. I didn't say anything. I just stood up, slung my purse over my shoulder, and walked out of the Palm Court. I could hear my sister calling after me, something about how I was being a baby, how it was just a joke, how I always had to make everything about myself. The maître d'eau watched me leave with a face carefully arranged to hold no expression. I think that was when I started crying because I remember swiping at my cheeks in the lobby mirror and being annoyed that my mascara had run. I made it out to Fifth Avenue and stood under the awning of the plaza for a long minute, just breathing. The doorman pretended not to notice. A horse-drawn carriage clopped past with a couple in the back drinking from plastic cups of champagne. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking too hard to type, so I just hit the contact and held the phone to my ear. He picked up on the second ring. Harper? His voice? God, his voice. I didn't even know what I was going to say until I heard him. Marcus, can you come get me? There was no pause. No questions. Just, where are you? The plaza. Out front, 20 minutes. He was there in 14. Marcus Ellsworth and I had been together for 2.5 years. He was a defense attorney at a mid-size firm in Midtown, the kind of man who wore the same charcoal coat every winter because it had been his father's. We'd met at a charity dinner I'd gotten dragged to by a colleague. He'd asked me what I did for a living, and when I'd said pediatric cardiac fellow, he'd asked me with genuine curiosity what the hardest case I'd ever had was. Most men ask me that question because they want me to perform my impressiveness for them. He asked because he wanted to know. When his black sedan pulled up to the curb, I got into the passenger seat without a word. He looked at me. He looked at the bag on my lap, the dress, the tear streaks. He didn't ask, he just reached across the console and took my hand and squeezed it. You don't have to talk yet, he said. Where do you want to go? I don't want to go home. Okay. He drove. He didn't put on music. He just drove. West on 59th. And after a while, he turned south, and after a while longer, he pulled up in front of a tiny Italian place in Hell's Kitchen that I'd never been to before. The kind with checkered tablecloths and a single waiter who calls everyone by their first name. He'd called ahead while I was still standing in front of the plaza. They sat us in the back, in a corner booth away from everyone. Tell me what happened, he said. So I did. I told him about the softly. I told him about the bill. I told him about my mother's recalculating eyes and my sister's sneering little laugh. I told him about the dress I'd never gotten to wear. I told him about all the missed birthdays of my own that had paid for my sister's birthdays, my sister's prom dress, my sister's 2 semesters of community college that she dropped out of, my sister's first car. I told him things I'd never said out loud before, things I hadn't even let myself think. He listened, he didn't interrupt. When the waiter came, he ordered carbonara for both of us and a bottle of something red. When I started crying again over the breadbasket, he didn't try to make me stop. He just slid the napkin closer to my hand. I'm sorry, he finally said when I'd run out of words. I'm so sorry, Harper. They had no right. It's just so embarrassing. You have nothing to be embarrassed about. They do. We stayed there until the kitchen closed. He paid the bill, opened the door for me, and drove me back to his apartment in Murray Hill. I'd been there 100 times before, but that night when he opened his front door, the air smelled like rosemary and something baking. He'd asked his sister on his way to get me to stop by his place and put a small cake in the oven. A coconut layer cake, my favorite, the one his mother used to make for him as a kid. He carried it out from the kitchen with one candle in the middle. He didn't sing. He just set it down on the coffee table in front of me and said, "I figured you still deserved a celebration tonight." I lost it. I just lost it. The sob that came out of me wasn't pretty. It wasn't restrained. It was the raw, wet, ugly kind that comes from a place you've been holding shut for years. He sat down on the couch next to me and pulled me into his shoulder and didn't say anything for a long time. When I'd quieted down, he said, "Make a wish." I closed my eyes. I wished for the first time in my life to stop being afraid of my own family. I blew the candle out. He cut me a slice. The frosting was a little uneven because his sister isn't a baker and the coconut was still slightly toasted on top, and it was the best birthday cake of my life. That night, I slept at his place. He put me in his old college t-shirt and tucked me into his bed and slept on the couch in the living room because he said he didn't want me to feel like I had to be anything for anyone tonight. In the morning, he made coffee. He didn't ask me what I wanted to do about my family. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." I went home that afternoon. I had 8 missed calls from my mother and a string of texts from my sister that started defensive and ended demanding. I read them all and didn't reply. I made myself a sandwich. I called the hospital and asked for 2 personal days, the first I'd taken in 3 years. For the first week, I just didn't engage. My mother left voicemails that escalated from concerned to wounded to furious. My sister sent a text that said, "You're being insane and Mom is crying," and another one that said, "Fine if you want to be like this. Don't expect anything from me at Christmas." I deleted them without responding. I went to work. I came home. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall and let myself feel, for the first time in maybe a decade, the full weight of what it had cost me to be the family's quiet provider. And then on the following Tuesday, I came home from a 14-hour shift to find a manila envelope wedged into my mailbox. It was from a credit reporting agency. I'd never signed up for one, but apparently someone had used my information to do it because there was an alert pinned to the top sheet. New credit accounts opened in my name in the last 60 days, 3 of them. A premium card with a $25,000 limit, a personal line of credit through an online lender, and, somehow most baffling of all, an auto loan for a Lexus SUV. I don't remember the next 10 minutes very clearly. I remember the next 10 minutes very clearly. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor with the envelope in my lap. I remember calling the credit card company and being transferred 3 times before I got to a fraud specialist. I remember her asking me to verify recent purchases. I remember her listing them off. A hotel in Tulum. A spa weekend in Sedona. A jewelry store in Soho, $8,000. A boutique in Beverly Hills. The Lexus had been picked up from a dealership in New Jersey 6 weeks earlier. I asked her, very calmly, who the authorized cardholders on the accounts were. She paused. She said the system showed 2 names listed as authorized users on 2 of the 3 credit accounts. She read me my mother's name. She read me my sister's name. I called my mother. I didn't shout. I asked her, in the calmest voice I had, why I had just received a credit alert listing her as an authorized user on an account I had never opened. She didn't even try to lie. She just sighed like I was being inconvenient. "Oh, honey, your sister and I needed a little help getting by, and you know how strict the banks are with us. We figured since you have such good credit, we'd just use your name a little. We were going to tell you. You opened credit cards in my name? It's not like that. We're family. It's all the same money in the end. You bought a car. In my name." The dealership was running a great rate. It would have been silly to let it pass. I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor for another 20 minutes. I didn't cry this time. Something underneath the crying had gotten very still and very cold. Then I called Marcus. He came over. He sat at my kitchen table with the envelope spread out in front of him and went through every single page, slowly, with a yellow legal pad next to him taking notes. When he was finished, he set down his pen. He looked at me. "This isn't a family matter, Harper. This is identity theft. This is bank fraud. This is a felony, multiple felonies, and the dollar amount puts it well into territory where the prosecutor's office is going to be very interested. They're my family. They're suspects in a federal financial crime. I didn't say anything for a long minute. I just looked at him. What do you want to do? He asked. He didn't push me, he just waited. I want to press charges, I said. All of them, civil, criminal, whatever there is to press, I want it pressed. Are you sure? They drove a Lexus SUV around for 6 weeks while I was operating on babies? I'm sure. The next morning, we went to the office of a colleague of his named Yvette Sandoval, a former federal prosecutor turned white-collar defense attorney who had pivoted to representing fraud victims. She walked me through everything. The criminal side would go through the district attorney's office. The civil side we'd handle directly with a lawsuit for damages, restitution, and emotional distress. She told me very gently that this kind of case almost always settles, but that if it went to trial, I'd need to be prepared to testify against my own mother and sister. I told her I was prepared. The reports got filed. The DA's office picked the case up within 2 weeks because the dollar amount and the documentation made it almost gift-wrapped for them. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit interviewed me for 3 hours in a beige conference room downtown. He was kind. He told me off the record that he saw cases like this more often than I'd think. Family was the most common perpetrator of identity theft in the country. He asked me if I was going to be okay testifying, and I said I would be. My father called me 2 weeks after the charges were filed. My father had been a quiet man all my life, an accountant who kept his head down and let my mother run the household however she pleased. I'd assumed for years that he agreed with the way she treated me. The truth, he told me on the phone that night, was that he hadn't known how bad it had gotten. He'd been working long hours in his own quiet way, and he'd let the women of the house define themselves to him through what they told him at the dinner table. He'd believed my mother when she'd said I was distant. He believed my sister when she'd said I was too important to bother with family things. He'd been wrong and he knew it now, and he was sorry. I cried. Quietly, with the phone held away from my mouth so he couldn't hear. He asked if there was any way to settle this without the criminal side. I told him no. I told him that if my sister had stolen from a stranger, no one in the family would expect that stranger to make it go away just because we'd asked nicely. I told him I loved him, and I meant it, and I told him that I needed him to understand that I was done being the family safety net. He said he understood. He showed up to the meeting Yvette arranged at her office a week later. So did my mother. So did my sister. So did Marcus, who sat next to me with his hand on the small of my back, and so did the detective, who was not legally required to be there but who Yvette had invited because she said it would clarify the stakes. My mother walked into that conference room ready for a fight. She put on her pearls and her best blazer, and she opened her mouth to say something cutting before she'd even fully sat down. My sister was right behind her, sullen, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. Before we start, Yvette said, I want to make sure everyone understands what's on the table. The criminal investigation is independent of this meeting. The DA's office has already filed charges. Nothing said here will change that. What we're discussing today is the civil suit and the question of restitution. My mother bristled. I don't understand why we need a civil suit when we're family. We can work this out at home. I looked at her. I really looked at her, for the first time in maybe my whole adult life. We're not going to work this out at home, Mom. You stole from me. You committed fraud in my name. Some of that money was used for a vacation in Tulum that you didn't even bother to invite me on. You drove around in a car bought with my credit while I was working 100-hour weeks. There is no version of this where I sit at your kitchen table and pretend that didn't happen. You're being ridiculous. We're your family. You keep saying that word like it's a coupon you can redeem for free things. My voice was steadier than I'd expected. Family is what you do, not what you call yourself. And what you did was steal from your daughter. My sister finally looked up. Her eyes were red. Why are you doing this? Like, do you actually want me to go to jail? I want you to understand what you did. It was just a little money. You bought a Lexus. You can afford it. There it was. The whole philosophy of my entire childhood condensed into one sentence and shouted across a conference table. I looked at her for a long time. Then I said, very quietly, it was never about whether I could afford it. It was about whether you believed I deserved to keep it. And you didn't. None of you ever did. That's the part you're going to spend the rest of your life understanding. My father, who had been silent the entire meeting, put his face in his hands. The civil case settled before trial. My mother and sister, on the advice of their own attorney, agreed to repay every dollar of the fraudulent debt plus damages. The total came to just under $300,000. They didn't have it. They were going to have to liquidate things to pay it. The Lexus, of course. My mother's jewelry. The vacation home and the Poconos that had been in my mother's family for decades. My sister was going to have to get a real job for the first time in her life. The criminal case did not settle. The DA's office offered my sister a plea deal of 18 months for the identity theft charges, with the financial fraud counts dropped if she cooperated. She took it. My mother got 2 years probation and community service because the DA decided she hadn't been the one physically signing the documents, only encouraging it. The judge gave her a tongue lashing from the bench that I hope she remembers on her deathbed. I didn't go to the sentencing. Marcus offered to come with me, and Yvette offered to walk me in, but I decided I didn't need to be there. I sat in my apartment that morning and made myself a cup of coffee and watered the orchid Marcus had given me when I moved in with him 3 months earlier. He'd asked me to move in the night the criminal charges were filed. He'd said he didn't want me sitting in my old apartment alone with all those ghosts. I'd said yes. We got married the following spring at a small ceremony in the Catskills. My father walked me down the aisle. He cried the whole way. My mother was not invited. My sister was not invited. A few cousins came who I hadn't spoken to in years, and they hugged me hard and told me they'd always known something was off in our family. They'd just never known how to bring it up. I forgave them for not bringing it up. There's only so much anyone outside a house can see. A month after the wedding, my mother sent me a long letter. It was handwritten, on the stationery she'd had since I was a kid, the kind with her initials embossed at the top. She wrote that she had spent her probation period in therapy. She wrote that she had finally understood what she'd done. She wrote that she had spent my entire childhood believing my sister needed her more because my sister was struggling and I was strong, and that she'd never once stopped to ask whether being strong was something I'd chosen or something I'd been forced into. She apologized for the dinner. She apologized for the credit cards. She apologized for the years of small things she'd never noticed she was doing. She asked if there was any path back. I read the letter 3 times. I put it in a drawer. I haven't responded yet. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I will someday. The thing about being the family ATM for 31 years is that even after the machine is unplugged, you don't owe anyone an explanation about when or whether you'll ever turn back on. What I know now is this: I was not the difficult one. I was not the cold one. I was not the sister who couldn't take a joke. I was a child, and then a young woman, and then a doctor who kept showing up for people who never once asked themselves whether they were showing up for me. The only joke at that birthday dinner was the one they'd been telling themselves for decades, that love was something I owed them and not something they owed me back. I'm 32 now. I have a husband who looks at me like I hung the moon. I have a job where I spend my days putting tiny hearts back together. I have a small apartment full of plants and books and one very loud orange cat. I have a father who calls me on Sunday afternoons and asks me every time if I'm doing okay and means it. And I have, finally, the one thing I never thought I was allowed to want, a life that belongs to me. I think back to that night at the plaza more often than I'd like to admit, not because of the bill or the souffle or even the look on my mother's face when she said the words perfect timing. I think about it because of the 12 minutes. 12 minutes was all it took for the people who shared my last name to decide I wasn't worth waiting for. And the truth I had to sit with, much later, was that those 12 minutes weren't really the cause of anything. They were just the moment I finally let myself see what had been there for 31 years. What happened to my mother and my sister wasn't bad luck. It wasn't fate turning against them. It was the slow, inevitable arithmetic of choices they had made for years and years. Choices that finally added up to a courtroom and a settlement and a Lexus they had to give back. They had treated my name like it was a credit line they could draw on without consequence. And one day the bill came due, the same way it always does for everyone who builds their comfort on someone else's silence. I didn't ruin their lives. They had been doing that themselves, slowly, every time they decided that loving me less was easier than respecting me more. The hardest lesson I had to learn, the one I'm still learning, is that being the strong one in a family isn't a virtue if no one ever asked you whether you wanted the job. I spent my entire childhood believing that earning love was the same as deserving it. I worked harder, I asked for less, I gave more, and I called that being a good daughter. It wasn't. It was being afraid. Real strength, the kind I had to grow into. The night I called Marcus from that sidewalk on 5th Avenue isn't about what you can carry. It's about knowing what you're allowed to put down. If there is one thing I'd want anyone watching to take from my story, it's that walking away from people who hurt you isn't the same as failing them. My father said something to me on the phone the night the criminal charges were filed that I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "You spent your whole life trying to be enough for us, and we never once asked if we were enough for you." That sentence broke something open in me that needed to be broken. It's the question every person in a quiet, lopsided family eventually has to ask themselves, and the answer is almost never what you've been told to believe. You don't owe anyone access to your life because you share blood with them. You don't owe forgiveness on anyone's timeline but your own. And you don't owe an explanation when you finally decide that the door stays closed. The wisdom isn't in holding on. The wisdom is in knowing finally that a life that belongs to you was never something you had to earn. It was always yours to claim.